Hey y'all! It's entry number 94 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Hunter Renfrow, wide receiver, Las Vegas Raiders. We'll start with the positives with Hunter Renfrow's fantasy profile. Red zone usage. In 2021, Hunter Renfrow had the 5th most targets inside the 20-yard line with 23, and the 4th most targets inside the 10-yard line with 13 in the entire NFL according to Pro Football Reference. Being frequently utilized in the red zone will give Renfrow more opportunities to score touchdowns and therefore fantasy points. The next thing I really like about Hunter Renfrow's fantasy profile is that he was a borderline WR1 in 2021. Hunter Renfrow had a fantastic 2021 season where he caught 103 passes on 128 targets for 1,038 receiving yards and 9 receiving touchdowns according to Pro Football Reference. From a fantasy perspective, during the 2021 season, Renfrow finished as the WR13 in standard with 156.1 total fantasy points and 9.2 fantasy points per game. The WR11 and half PPR formats with 207.6 total fantasy points and 12.2 fantasy points per game, and the WR10 in full PPR formats with 259.1 total fantasy points and 15.2 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. The last thing I really like about Hunter Renfrow's fantasy profile is his week-to-week consistency. During the 2021 season, in half PPR formats, Hunter Renfrow had 1 out of 17 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 5 out of 17 games with 5 to 9.9 fantasy points, 7 out of 17 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 3 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 1 out of 17 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Moving on to some of the concerns with Hunter Renfrow's fantasy profile. Added competition. The Las Vegas Raiders made a trade for arguably the best wide receiver in the league in Davante Adams. Davante Adams and Darren Waller will each warrant large target shares in 2022, which may put a cap on Hunter Renfrow's target ceiling in 2022. The next concern I have with Hunter Renfrow's fantasy profile is that he's not particularly athletic for a pro wide receiver. For a professional athlete, Hunter Renfrow is not a guy that stands out athletically. He's just 5'10" and weighs 184 pounds. He has just a 34th percentile 40-yard dash at 4.59, an 11th percentile speed score at 79.5, a 31st percentile burst score at 117.5, and a 25th percentile catch radius at 9.85 according to Player Profiler. Not being particularly athletic could put a bit of a cap on Renfrow's ceiling. The last major concern I have with Hunter Renfrow's fantasy profile is his mediocre air yards. Hunter Renfrow averaged just 48.7 air yards per game and had just 1.16 air yards per snap in 2021 according to RotoWire. His air yard share of 18% ranked 70th among wide receivers in 2021 according to Player Profiler. He's not getting many downfield targets, so his yards per reception is likely going to be lower than the typical fantasy wide receiver, which means that it's more important that he maintains a decent target share in general to stay fantasy relevant. Some additional thoughts on Hunter Renfrow's fantasy profile. Hunter Renfrow had 452 yards after the catch in 2021, which ranked as the 14th most in the NFL according to Pro Football Reference. Over the course of Josh McDaniels' career as an NFL offensive play caller, his wide receiver room as a whole has averaged 21.12 targets per game, which has resulted in pretty solid receiving production. QB play. Raiders quarterback Derek Carr completed 428 passes on 626 passing attempts for 4,804 passing yards and 23 passing touchdowns to just 14 interceptions during the 2021 season according to Pro Football Reference. Personal opinion. Hunter Renfrow is currently going off the board as WR32, about pick 79 overall, on ESPN, and WR34, but picked 96 overall on Yahoo. Renfrow may not seem like a good pick at first glance because he's not very athletic relative to other NFL wide receivers. But once you actually watch him on the field, you see that he's a great football player with his sharp routes and his attention to detail. He's a guy that I think will most likely be underrated year in and year out in fantasy leagues over the course of his career, because a majority of people are more drawn to the physical freak types of players. He seems like a solid value at his current price, and I will probably have a few shares of him in 2022. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Hunter Renfrow's My Cause My Cleats in 2021 was for the Dabo Sweeney's All In Foundation. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.